I would like to first say welcome to everybody. This is the Center for the Blue Economy speaker series, and we kind of converge with the environmental justice and sustainability speaker series as well in the fall. This is our first lecture that is both a part of a class for our international environmental studies students that are specifically concentrating on oceans and coasts. And so the Center for the Blue Economy series, we focused on oceans and coasts, hence Dr. Brooks tonight talking about the Antarctic and its connection to policy and the world. So we're so grateful to have you tonight, Dr. Brooks. But before we begin, on the environmental justice side, I'd like to keep the tradition that we started last term with reading a land acknowledgement, which is to acknowledge the first peoples of the area that we are physically meeting, which is Monterey, California. And the first peoples of this area called this area the Iciest. And there were many different bands and tribes, the Ohlone, the Costanoan, the Esselen nations, the Carmeleno, the Monterey Band, the Rumsen, the Chalon. And these were the indigenous people of the Monterey area. And in fact, this I'm diverging here a bit from the land acknowledgement, but we here in the Monterey area had one of the longest standing permanent settlements along the coast, because there was fresh water here as well. And for the new students, most of you are first years, every day at about 2 or 3 o'clock, you'll see this gush of water coming from under the old adobe that's just near the Center for the Blue Economy Craig building. And that is the freshwater spring being pumped out from under that old adobe so that it does not flood it. So this was a long-standing, permanent, not a seasonal settlement of First Nations. We acknowledge them today. And I'm so glad that the Middlebury Institute offers a scholarship now for Indigenous people. So with that land acknowledgement out of the way, Jason, would you like to introduce our speaker?
Sure, yes. So Dr. Cassandra Brooks is an expert on Antarctica and is to talk to us today about, one of these extreme environments that we know is very important for both climate change in terms of impacts, but also where a lot of the impacts are being felt, right? So it's kind of on both ends, right? And it's something I think, we like to start with kind of these big picture talks, because again, a lot of biodiversity, a lot of real climate change kind of convergence in this part of the world. And it's an area that not many people know a lot about. So Dr. Brooks, we're very happy to have you here, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I guess too, just to say, I am joining you from the traditional territory of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. So here we are crossing
awesome
Western communities. I am sorry I can't be here in person with you, but as Rachel and I were discussing before you all joined, it also is great that I'm not flying and contributing to the problems that we're having. We've here in Colorado had pretty much a constant second summer in a row of smoke from fires, which we all know are linked to climate change. But thank you for having me. I do definitely encourage you to have your video on if you're comfortable with it, certainly at least for the discussion, but I also understand that everybody's sort of zoomed out and maybe like you're in your pajamas, and that's totally cool. I'm definitely going to take you a deep dive into Antarctic marine protected areas, and this crosses biodiversity and diplomacy. I'm really excited to share a specific story with you today, but I need to start by taking you to Antarctica. So give me a sec with my slides. Bada bing. And this is a icy continent I think most of you are familiar with at the bottom of the world here. Has anyone in the group been to Antarctica? Had the great pleasure of no, okay. So it is this amazing continent. And what I really want you to know about it is that before the continent was discovered, it was actually the last continent that was discovered. The ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north. They said without that, the whole world would topple over. And I love that metaphor because the Greeks were actually more right than they knew. Because since its discovery, scientists have documented that the Antarctic stores the majority of the world's fresh water, it regulates our climate, and it drives global ocean circulation. And despite its harsh conditions, it is the coldest, windiest, driest continent in the world, the Antarctic waters actually teem with life. In fact, some of our last healthy marine ecosystems are in Antarctica. And to illustrate that, this is a study in front of you, and just to orient you to the map, the continents are in white and the oceans are around it. And this study, which was published in Science in 2008, tried to map human impacts, global human impacts on the marine systems. And the spectrum goes from red to blue, with red being the most damaged marine ecosystems and blue being the least damaged. And hopefully what stands out on this map for you is how little blue we actually have in this system. In fact, the few blue areas we have left are there around Antarctica and parts of the Arctic. So why do we have these healthy marine ecosystems left in Antarctica? Well, part of it is that the continent is protected by a shield of ice. In front of you is the Antarctic winter on the left and the Antarctic summer on the right. And you can see it literally has this shield of ice that forms around it every winter. And even in the summer, we have ice that persists. But it's not just ice, it's also remoteness. It's really far away, but it's also political will. In Antarctica, we have this amazing history of exploration and science that has created a framework for international collaboration and data sharing. And indeed, scientists work side by side in Antarctica despite political tensions at home. That sort of goes away when you get on the ice, and that's true to today. And I want to highlight in particular, there was a 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, which focused on bringing 12 different countries to work together in Antarctica. It was a scientific collaboration that was pretty unprecedented. And that scientific collaboration actually led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. This was at the height of the Cold War, and it is absolutely amazing. The Antarctic Treaty system as a whole, so there's a suite of treaties, which includes the Antarctic Treaty, sets aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. And it absolutely grants freedom of science. It prohibits military operations. It prohibits nuclear anything, including nuclear energy, but certainly no nuclear weapons. It suspends sovereignty. And it bans mining. And I really can't stress to you what an amazing agreement this is. It sets aside the continent as a de facto world park. And I truly think it's one of our greatest achievements. And it still is that way today. Huge, huge zone that no military, no nuclear, anything is allowed. So under the Antarctic Treaty System is this Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR is the acronym that I'm going to use throughout this talk. And CAMLR is the group that manages the oceans around Antarctica. And this is a picture of the decision-making room and then a picture of the building, which is based in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. And if you haven't heard of CAMLR, definitely check out what they do. They are absolutely considered a leader in marine resource management. They have this convention, this legal convention that actually mandates that all fisheries have to have a precautionary, science-based and ecosystem approach. It literally has language around that you can't fish a species in a way that would damage the ecosystem, and you can't fish a species in a way that it wouldn't recover within 20 to 30 years. And the idea was that you're ensuring there's fish there for future generations. So it really is an amazing convention. It came into force in 1982. So I feel like it was a bit ahead of its time, even though we talk a lot about these concepts today. There are two main fisheries in the Southern Ocean right now, and the first is krill and the second is toothfish, and I'll just tell you a little bit about both of these. Antarctic krill are the key prey species in the Southern Ocean food web. We actually think they have 300 to 500 million tons of krill, so the most abundant animal in terms of biomass on Earth, and they absolutely feed everything, or almost everything, in the Southern Ocean. They're super, super important, and they're pretty big. They actually are about 5 to 6 centimeters, so pretty big for a crustacean. For a krill anyways. And the fishery there is actually, they're not being harvested for human consumption. It's largely for fish meal and omega-3 pills. Krill actually aren't super good to eat, and so they're ground up and fed to salmon or pigs or chickens, or they're sold as pharmaceuticals for people and pets. And so there's increasing pressure on this fishery because, as you probably know, there's increasing aquaculture happening, and there's also an increasing market for these fish omega-3 pills. And so krill are the main prey species. And then the other thing that's fished in Antarctica are toothfishes. There's two species, Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish. And these are the top fish predators. So you can see this picture, how big they get. They grow in excess of 6 feet, absolutely huge. And they're an extraordinary fish. Besides the fact that they're like this top fish predator, they act as the sharks in Antarctica. they're also a key prey species. Actually, a lot of the mammal species feed on toothfish, Weddell seals. There's a specific subgroup of orcas that feeds on toothfish, sperm whales. So they're really important prey and predator item. And the fishery for toothfish, like maybe you're like, I've never heard of toothfish. They're actually sold as Chilean sea bass. So if you've seen that at grocery stores, they're a really lucrative fishery. If you're grad students, you're probably not buying these because they're really expensive, but that's what they're sold as. And in other places, they have different names. Like in Chile, they're sold as Bacalao de Profundidad. And I love that because it basically means cod of the deep or deep cod, but it also, I like to think about it as the profound cod, because this fish is really what first brought me to Antarctica. Is that I fell into a study during my master's degree, actually about 15 years ago, studying the life history of this fish. And the reason I was studying it is that at the time there was a growing commercial fishery in the Ross Sea, Antarctica, for toothfish, and people didn't know a lot about it. They were trying to manage this fishery, but they didn't necessarily know how old it gets. You know, when does it mature? When does it spawn? How does it spawn? And so I literally fell into this amazing study, studying this fish. And I have to tell you, I grew up in like rural New Hampshire. I mean, we rarely left the city. I grew up in our town. I grew up in, let alone moving across state lines, let alone going to Antarctica. Like that wasn't on my radar. I didn't think people even did that. And so it was such a profoundly amazing experience for me, but it also really brought home when I was down there, literally what felt like at the bottom of the world. You know, the stars are different. You don't see other people. The wildlife isn't afraid of you. The penguins and whales just come right up to your ship because they're not used to seeing people. And then to imagine that we're fishing down there, and these pictures are from vessels fishing in Antarctica, and literally vessels do get stuck in the ice every single year, or the waves get so big that they take ships down, or they get fires at sea. It's absolutely the most treacherous oceans in the world, the most remote oceans in the world. And yet when I was there, I was like, why are we fishing down here? It makes no sense. Like, talk about a carbon footprint, talk about a cost to send vessels literally to the most remote waters in the world to catch fish. Just didn't make sense to me. But it brought home for me the problems we have with fisheries everywhere, right? And what we're seeing in Antarctica is that vessels have, you know, overexploited in waters closest to shore, shallow waters, and they have to move into deeper and deeper waters and into more remote waters, right? This is the trend. And Antarctica is literally like the end of that trend, right? And this is just a figure from the United Nations FAO that brings that home for me anyways, where basically blue is the undeveloped fisheries, the places we have left to explore, and the sort of brown, red, yellow is the collapsed, overexploited, fully exploited. And what this figure tells you, the one takeaway I want you to take from it, is that by 2008, 90% of our fisheries were collapsed, overexploited, or fully exploited. And that leaves little room for finding new fisheries. And so the Antarctic is one of these few places where we actually have some populations of toothfish that have never been fished, right? And that's crazy to imagine, but we actually have that here. But that means there's more pressure, right? We have growing krill fisheries for fish meal, for omega-3 pills. We have growing pressure on toothfish because they're such a valuable fish. And we have this trend of overexploitation everywhere else, right? This map just gives you a sense of what that looks like in Antarctica. The krill fisheries are in red and the toothfish fisheries are in green. So the krill fisheries are very much concentrated around the Antarctic Peninsula, which is where most of the krill live. And then toothfish fisheries are scattered throughout. And to give you a sense of this growing nature of this international fishery, in front of you is a map, and every flag on the map is a vessel from a country that notified to fish in the last year. So you start to get a sense of, here we are, again, most remote fishery is literally bottom of the world, and yet more and more countries are participating in fishing in the Southern Ocean. So I've emphasized this fishing that's happening, this increasing pressure. Climate change in Antarctica, if you've read the news at all, you've probably read about the instability of the Western Antarctic ice sheet, the massive melting that is happening in some areas. The figure in front of you tries to summarize those trends. It's a complicated story in Antarctica. The areas in blue are actually areas that right now are cooling, getting more ice. And the areas in red are areas that are warming and getting less ice, including areas where we're seeing glacial retreat, ice shelf collapse. And you can see the Western Antarctic Peninsula, which is this whole area, is just absolutely melting like crazy. And that's where the majority of the krill live. I told you everything eats krill. And so these changes are dramatic in the Southern Ocean. What's really hard is differentiating, okay, what's from fishing, what's from climate change, what's part of these like natural cycles. In Antarctica, we have some extremes, right, which actually can kind of mask some of the climate change impacts, but it's definitive that change is happening, and that it's happening with increasing speed in the Antarctic. And the ecosystem impacts, again, we don't totally know, but we know that krill are changing. There's some evidence that the populations are decreasing, they're contracting, they're trying to move south, but obviously like they can only go so far south because there's a continent in the way. Same thing with penguin populations. Some of the ones that depend on ice and cold water are moving south, but eventually they'll have nowhere else to go. That's just the reality of the situation. So I've told you a couple things that I want to bring up again right now. I've told you that the Antarctic is home to some of our last healthy marine ecosystems on the planet. I've told you that CAMLAR is this leader in international ocean management, but I've also told you there's increasing pressure to fish and that the system is under threat of climate change, right? So what do we do, right? Like, what do we do in the Southern Ocean? The question is really, how do we maintain ecosystem health and provide for sustainable use of fisheries? And if you are in a marine space, you probably know a bit about marine protected areas, but just to define them, there are areas where human activities are restricted to meet specific conservation, protection, or fisheries management objectives. And you probably know they're an increasingly popular tool for conserving marine biodiversity and managing fisheries. And part of that is in line with global targets. More and more international targets are calling for more marine protected areas. And the reason they're calling for them is that they work. They actually do conserve biodiversity. This is just one meta-analysis of many studies where Sarah Lester pulled together data on 124 marine reserves from 29 countries and showed, this is amazing, a 446% increase in biomass. So the sheer amount of things living in the protected area versus the not protected area went up dramatically. The density, so the amount living per area went up, the size, so how big the animal gets went up, and then the species richness or diversity also went up. So really amazing, and that they lead to more diversity of species in greater numbers and larger sizes. So that's part of why we're seeing this increasing trend. Like we know they work, right? We have enough science now to show that. They also benefit fisheries if they're designed well. I should clarify, if they're designed well and they're managed well, they can also benefit fisheries. And there's a lot of studies that have shown that you can see recovery of depleted fish. Larger fish actually make more babies. I love this example of a female red snapper. If you let them live to be 8 years old, they actually produce as many eggs as the equivalent of 212 5-year-olds. So a 5-year-old fish just produces very few eggs. You let them live another 3 years and they're dramatically more productive. And this is so obviously isn't the case with humans, but with fish, literally the older they get, the more and more babies they have. So again, the fish in the MPAs can actually get bigger and have more babies. And then you're probably familiar with the idea of a spillover effect, but again, a well-designed MPA will actually allow for those big fish in the protected area to have their babies, which spill out to the surrounding areas. So amazing benefits, potential benefits to fisheries. I think in the context of the Southern Ocean, perhaps what's most important is that marine protected areas can enhance resilience. And what I mean by that is that because they maintain all the trophic levels, they maintain the diversity of the ecosystem, and they're increasing species and genetic diversity, that actually enhances resilience to environmental change, including climate change. And a lot of people ask me that, they're like, well, what the heck does a protected area do for climate change, right? It can't stop climate change. It's not going to do anything. We absolutely need to reduce emissions. Obviously, is like the #1 thing we all need to do. But what it can do is you reduce all those other stressors, you take out fishing, you take out human impacts so that system and those species have the best chance of adapting and surviving the change, if that makes sense. So CAMLAR, kind of in line with their leadership, they actually started working towards marine protected areas in 2012. And I should have clarified, so CAMLAR is actually comprised of 26 different nation states. So it's this multinational body. And they, as this multinational body, actually committed to the World Summit on Sustainable Development Goals that came out in 2002 about, they were like, yeah, we're going to designate a Southern Ocean network of marine protected areas by 2012. And they adopted the world's first international MPA in 2009, fully no-take marine protected area. Just one point to make on marine protected areas is that you want them to be representative of biodiversity, right? So if you want them to work, if you actually want to protect biodiversity of the system, you need to protect all the different habitats and species that live there. Not to get into the maps in front of you, only to say that we've mapped out what is that, what are the different benthic habitats and the pelagic habitats, and we've developed a system for where we need protected areas to make sure we capture everything, that we capture all those colors on the map in front of you. And that's what we've been trying to do in the Southern Ocean, is to have a network around the whole thing that actually encompasses all the colors on the map in front of you. Now, I want to take you to the Ross Sea specifically. This was a priority area for protection very early on in discussions. And the reason it was a priority area, and this is the same map I showed you earlier on in the talk, is that out of that global assessment, the Ross Sea came out as being the most intact large marine ecosystem left in the world. So of all the other areas in the oceans, when they scored all the human impacts, they measured 17 different things. They found that the Ross Sea was sort of this last large area left, right? That was relatively healthy, if you will. And so it really became this priority, like, oh, well, we should protect it, right? before it gets damaged, in part because we want to have a place that actually is a healthy system. So we know how healthy systems function. Like, what does a healthy marine ecosystem looks like? Like, we need to know that as scientists and as managers. The Ross Sea also is the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean. The picture in front of you is actually taken by NASA from outer space, and that the green is a phytoplankton bloom. And this massive phytoplankton bloom happens every summer in the Ross Sea. You know, in Antarctica, you have winter, which is dark. It's like 24 hours of darkness. And then you have the sun finally rises. And when it rises, you're also having winds that are pushing the ice away from the ice shelf here. And when those winds happen, you get upwelling, and then the sun finally comes out. And as you can imagine, it's like this burst of phytoplankton life. And in the Ross Sea in particular, there's this polynya, or open body of water, that facilitates that process. And so this massive bloom of productivity enhances the Ross Sea's ecosystem, and the Ross Sea actually supports a disproportionate amount of wildlife. It's only about 3% of the Southern Ocean, but 35% of the world's Adelie penguins live there. 25% of the world's emperors. Emperors are your March of the Penguins. Majority, or 30% of the Antarctic petrels, half of the world's South Polar skuas, and we have minke whales and a variety of seals that also disproportionately live there in the Ross Sea. Of course, we have the toothfish that I mentioned to you as well, which gives you a sense of the amazing life that is there. These are all photos from the Ross Sea, Antarctica. So to tell the story, a lot of the working towards protecting the story starts with this man in front of you, Dr. David Ainley, who's actually based in Sausalito, California. So he could come maybe give a talk too. He's amazing. And he had studied the Ross Sea for decades. And the reason he studied the Ross Sea is that it was an intact system. He grew up in the Northeast, then lived in California, and felt like everywhere he was seeing damaged marine systems. And so he absolutely fell in love with working in the Ross Sea and wanted to study it as this healthy space, as a living laboratory for knowing what a healthy system looks like. And he, in 2002, he started seeing some of these fishing vessels come into the Ross Sea and was like, I'm not seeing the system go down on my watch. I'm not seeing these commercial fisheries grow. We have to protect this place. So in 2002, he actually submitted this really obscure paper to CAMLR. And you can see the title there. It's like, the Ross Sea, Antarctica, where all ecosystem processes still remain for study, essentially saying, yes, we need to keep this place intact. But he sent this paper in 2002, and then he began galvanizing the scientific community, right? He actually got more than 500 scientists to sign this petition for protecting the Ross Sea. And this is amazing. Like, scientists don't usually advocate, right? Like, we're always told, don't advocate, don't raise your voice. And this scientist absolutely was like, I can't in my lifetime see this place go down like I've seen so many other places. And he began really fighting for it. His obscure papers actually got the attention of Boulder, Colorado-based photographer John Weller, who literally was a college friend of John's, who came and gave a paper of David's to him. And John was a photographer who had been working in Colorado and really doing deep storytelling to basically work towards conservation. And so when he found out about this story in this place, I mean, he had never been diving in his life. He hadn't really even spent much time on the ocean. But when he found out about this, he committed to telling the story of the Ross Sea and branded it as the last ocean. And he actually went out to California, met with David, and they were like, we're going to do this. You do the science, I'll do the outreach, I'll do the photography, bring the place to people. They recruited a filmmaker from New Zealand. New Zealand is where the major toothfish fisheries come out of. And so they recruited a filmmaker in New Zealand. And then John actually found me. I was studying toothfish at the time, at the end of it. And he basically approached me and said, we need to talk about toothfish. That might not sound like a pickup line to most of you, but for me, it was like he had me at, toothfish. And he convinced me to join this project and eventually convinced me to move to Boulder, to marry him, to have his kids. And here I remain with him. But we have a very, very long personal journey working on this Last Ocean project together. And we created an absolute flood of media. So again, David started in 2002, John came on in 2004, pulled me on a few years later, and we just created an absolute flood of media, articles. We produced a documentary, award-winning documentary film, largely, again, New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young led on this. Produced this book that we literally like hand delivered to governments to try to get their support for it. And then we worked with a variety of environmental groups to try to produce policy documents that were produced in multiple languages. And I'm saying we worked with a huge coalition of obviously government scientists. I mentioned hundreds of scientists, and then these environmental groups that are actually based all over the world as well. So we were working in collaboration with them, trying to really raise support for this place. Working with some of these conservation groups, we were able to get celebrity support. And I wish you didn't need celebrity support. Like, I feel like we'd put out a petition and try to get people to sign it. You'd get like 10 signatures, maybe 100. This guy, you know, puts out a petition and we'd get millions of signatures, which is really cool. It was like a really powerful tool to use in the campaign. And then of course, just people on the streets. This is actually a picture of outside of CAMLAR, which is usually the stoic stone building where negotiations are happening inside. It's closed doors, you can't get inside the room, the public's not allowed in there. And so with working with conservation groups, we were able to get the public like really galvanized, like really excited, writing protest signs in multiple different languages. And then you can see the binoculars in the picture. And that was trying to symbolize like, we're watching you, like the public, we're actually watching you and your decision making, and we're putting pressure on you to protect this place. And then we created a flood of science, like over the course of all the years working on this campaign. David really was leading it, David Ainley, but working with a lot of different collaborators to just try to like keep the science coming on the threats to this area, how amazing the Ross Sea is. And eventually all this pressure, in the midst of all this pressure, the United States and New Zealand actually came together and proposed an actual like proposal for a marine protected area. And they started planning that in 2010. We're still planning it in 2011. In 2012, they finally submitted a proposal to CAMLAR. So this is like 10 years into what I told you started with David Ainley writing an obscure paper. 10 years later, there's a formal proposal on the table. And you're all students of international, things. And so you know how long these things take. So, 10 years, it does feel like a long time though, I won't lie to you. So 10 years in, we get this proposal on the table, but you have to convince all these governments. So CAMLAR makes decisions on consensus. So every single one of those countries have to unanimously agree. If one country doesn't agree with a proposal, then it won't move forward. And they don't vote, they don't raise hands. It's just an initiative will come. And if a country raises their flag and is like, I don't like it, it won't go forward. And you only meet once a year. So you have literally like 1-2 week policy window a year to actually move things through. And so I went back for my PhD actually starting in 2012. And I managed to finagle my way into this decision-making room. You can see I'm literally like in the back corner of the room. I'm not at that decision-making table. But through the PhD, I knew the proposal was coming to the table. I'd worked on it and I was like, I want to study this process. I want to understand. And part of that was I understood the science, I understood the public outreach, but I didn't know how the policy decisions were made. Like we were targeting New Zealand, we were targeting countries, but I was like, I don't actually know how these decisions are made. And I felt like I needed to get in the room to really understand that. So I had this amazing PhD experience of sitting on the delegation of one of the conservation groups, the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, and basically offering to take notes from them and help out in the delegation. And I got to have that corner spot and study and observe. And I want to just like briefly walk you through this process of building the consensus. So at this time, CAMLAR only had 25 member states. And again, we had to get every single country to agree. And that's really what this was about. And I'm presenting to you a mix of like my personal involvement and now my research on this process of understanding consensus. And I won't share with you every detail, but just to kind of give you the summary of how this worked, all these countries. And it was really in the mid-90s that these discussions started, and the United Kingdom actually took leadership on that, like bringing science around protected areas to CAMLAR. The IUCN actually got involved at that time too. And then we had these early allies, if you will, like countries that support, hosted workshops, gave money, like things like that to actually do some bioregionalization and some planning around the MPAs. And then we had this period of mainstream endorsement. And as I mentioned to you, the MPA first for the Ross Sea first came to the table in 2012. The map in front of you is what that protected area looked like. It probably looks a little bit funny, the boundaries. I'll explain the boundaries a little bit more in a minute, but they're based on a variety of things, a mix of science and trade-offs, accommodations for various things. But that's what the original proposal looked like. And immediately they had the support of almost half the countries. But if you look at the countries supporting, it's a lot of Western states, right? Obviously the US is on there, New Zealand, Australia, a lot of the European Union states. So countries that kind of have a MPA agenda already as part of their national agenda, right? As the years went by in 2013, more support was added. But if you look at the map for a second, so here's 2012, here's 2013. So what happened in those years is that the protected area was reduced in size, where some areas in the north were removed. And that was in part to accommodate some interests from fishing countries who were like, they felt like that area was too understudied to set aside, and they wanted to leave it open. So that was a compromise that happened along the way. 2014 was fascinating. One of the countries that joined in consensus in 2014 was Ukraine. They had always voted in unison with Russia every single year until 2014. And maybe not to overstate the obvious, but really what happened was the invasion of Crimea, and Russia and Ukraine were no longer voting in unison. And this was fascinating for me to watch these sort of larger geopolitical things playing out in this consensus process. So that left China and Russia as the last two countries not supporting in this space. And I want to back out just for a second to, again, explain the boundaries of the MPA a little bit for you. So the map in front of you is a conservation ranking. And essentially what it tries to do is to say, what areas are the highest value? And when you design a marine protected area, this is some of the work that you do. And in this, they really looked at the different predators, the penguins, the toothfish, the seals, like what are they using, right, the most? And the darkest blue, the spectrum is from dark blue to light blue. So dark blue are the areas of absolute highest conservation value. And hopefully what you can see is like, it's largely the shelf and slope. And this makes sense because this is like a large upwelling zone, right, on the shelf and slope. And so a lot of life there. These are seamounts. And so you have a lot of life there, right? This is by far the most important area, Island Bank. It was absolutely a priority area for protection. It was where everything passed through on its way, like a lot of animals migrate north. But you can see it wasn't part of the boundaries. The boundaries of the MPA are in black. So that area was always left out of the MPA. And of course, you're like, why? I was like, why? Why was it left out? Well, that's because if you actually map out the fishing, then you can see in yellow are the major fishing grounds. And so for better or for worse, this MPA, in order to accommodate all those different countries and their interests, the proposal was designed to like, let's protect as much as we can of that shelf and slope and these seamounts, but leaving that major fishing area open. And then even the SRZ stands for Special Research Zone. And this area was negotiated to be part of the MPA, but it has a lower amount of fishing and more science, more tagging and things happening in that area. So these were compromises that were just part of the reality of the negotiation process. So fishing was a big deal. But it was more complicated than fishing. And I was able to do research interviews with the head diplomat and the head scientist. So what you're looking at in front of you is that decision-making table at CAMLAR. It's a relatively small community. Like I said, at the time, it was 25 different countries. And so they're all sitting at a table together. It's like face-to-face interaction every single year. And so I was able to interview the top diplomat, top scientists, the ones who sit at the table. I was able to interview them from almost every country and to try to get a sense of what's going on with this process. Why is it taking so long? Besides fishing, what else is going on? And what the interview showed is how divisive the MPA process had been, where people actually described CAMLAR negotiations as antagonistic and hostile, stagnant, stalled, divided. They said that the MPA process was ruined, deadlocked, at a dead end, that there was no road open, no hope. And that positions had become entrenched, finding commonality was difficult, the process had gone on too long, becoming divisive and polarized, and that trust was gone or broken in CAMLAR. And again, that's trust being gone and broken is a big deal because it's this relatively small community of countries that are working together. I did do the interviews in 2014. So again, politically in the world, that was a difficult time in general. But one of the things that they were alluding to in terms of trust was this issue of, are these protected areas based on ecological boundaries or are they based on political boundaries? Now, I told you that Antarctic sovereignty is suspended under the signing of the treaty, but this is a map of what Antarctica looked like in 1959 before that treaty was signed. And so we had 7 different countries that had sovereignty claims, and you can see their claims on the map in front of you. And these were based on, you know, planting flags, mapping, whaling, all sorts of things that these claims were based on. At the time, the USSR and US both reserved their right to claim the whole continent. And so they're in there with that. These 7 countries have claims, and then these other 2 power countries potentially have claim to the whole thing. So it was this real time of conflict where we had competing claims. You can see Chile, Argentina, and the UK actually had overlapping claims. You had the US and USSR competing, and it was a really tense time politically, and there was actually threat of nuclear war breaking out on the Antarctic continent over some of these things. And so when the treaty came to force, it was like absolutely amazing again that these claims were set aside, the differences were set aside. But when you look at where the MPAs are planned, they're planned where the countries do science, and the countries do science where they have bases, and they have bases in their historic claims. And so the Ross Sea MPA, the boundaries are like legit like political boundaries, right? Like there it is nestled in New Zealand's claim. And again, the US and New Zealand proposed this MPA. The US has the largest science base in the area. So it's a double-edged sword where that's where countries are doing science. That's where they get money to do science, right? So that's essentially like where you have to work. And that's where countries will put money into conservation planning. And that's what I mean by double-edged. Like it's great they're doing science, but then it becomes this almost like, is it political, right? And are these boundaries actually political? The South Orkney Islands MPA is the small one, the one that was adopted in 2009, and that's in the UK claim. It was put forward by the UK. And then some of the other proposals on the table are being led by countries in their former territories. So these claims are suspended, but they still drive where countries work. And this came up in negotiations, like these accusations that like, hey, you're just using this conservation tool as a power thing, right, to reinforce your claim. And so again, a lot of these challenges, it's that trade-off between protection and fishing, and countries thinking not just about fishing right now, but hey, I might want to fish in the future. I don't want to close these huge areas. And I've mentioned these larger geopolitics, some of them being Antarctic focused and some of them being larger. In particular, like I said, 2014, tensions between US and Russia were high, and negotiations in the room that year, for instance, had nothing to do with MPAs. The countries were just blocking each other over everything. So a really pivotal moment was when we got the attention of former Secretary of State John Kerry. And what happened, this was in 2013, but working with National Geographic and the Pew Charitable Trust, we were able to show a version of the Last Ocean film to him and actually really get him excited about the Ross Sea. And he decided in 2013 that he wanted it to be part of his legacy, right? He wanted it to happen in his term. And this was absolutely critical for getting the support of the last 2 countries, China and Russia, as I mentioned. And so John Kerry did a ton of high-level diplomacy and really had a loud voice in this. You probably know John Kerry had an oceans agenda, like oceans were part of his, like what he wanted to be his legacy. And so learning about this, he really went all in, and it really was through him that we heard stories from the White House that actually President Obama was able to incorporate a Ross Sea MPA into climate negotiations with China in 2015. And then China shows up in 2015 and actually agrees to the Ross Sea MPA. It was absolutely remarkable. And I think it was a mix of that high-level diplomacy and also some of the scientists working within China in the room and trying to get at like, okay, what is it that China wants, right? Like, or what is it that they're not agreeing to? And one of the things they really wanted was a krill research zone. They wanted an additional part of the MPA tacked on there that would be part of the MPA, but allow for krill research fishing. So that was important to them. And I think for precedent setting, like nobody's fishing for krill in the Ross Sea, just to be clear. And the other thing they negotiated was the limited duration so that the MPA wouldn't go on forever. But that got them on board. And so when we came into the 26th meeting, there was this, maybe, I thought at the moment, like a window of opportunity where Russia was completely isolated. It was Secretary Kerry's like last term, right? And this was like his last moment. And so from what we heard, he was really working really hard in Russia, negotiating with his counterparts. Russia was chairing CAMLR this year, which provided this opportunity for leadership. And there were a lot of things happening. Russia was celebrating their 200th anniversary of finding the Antarctic continent. Of course, the UK and US also claim that they found the Antarctic continent, but nonetheless, Russia was celebrating that. And they had this year of ecology in 2017. So there were a lot of things happening that gave this like opportunity for leadership. And the combination of those things in 2016, Russia did come to consensus. And I actually wish I could share that moment with you in the room because the meetings go on for 2 weeks. We had been negotiating the Ross Sea MPA for 5 years at this point, 10 years of scientific effort before then. And it was like the meeting was so intense. Like they kept having these heads of delegation meetings where they'd kick us out of the room and just the heads of delegation would discuss and we'd come back in and we'd have no idea what was going on. or the chair would say, oh, I think we're there. And then one country would raise their flag and be like, well, I don't agree with this. And this just went on the whole time. And it was like the final night of the meeting and another heads of delegation meeting. And finally everyone came back and the chair was like, we have it. We have consensus on a Ross Sea MPA. And the room literally exploded in applause. Countries were hugging countries. Like my husband and I are in the back of the room crying. The scientists are crying. Like everyone was just absolutely freaking out about this. And I think it was like, yes, this was an amazing environmental win. It's a gift for the future. It's this global commons, but it also was this diplomatic win. Like it was, for me, it brought back this feeling of when I'd read about the signing of the treaty at the height of the Cold War, where you had countries with really high diplomatic tensions, but here in Antarctica, they were putting those aside and agreeing to do this thing, right? That was really for the good of the world. This really is like all of our MPA. And the map in front of you is what the CAMLR office printed out after it was adopted, and they invited all those delegations to come and sign it. And so you can see the names of all these different delegates from all these different countries that were signing it. It was like immediately a source of pride. And this is actually still framed at the CAMLR office. The Ross Sea MPA is still the world's largest MPA. It's more than 2 million kilometers squared, and 70% of that is no take. So I told you there are some of these fishing zones, but the majority of it is not. So I'm always reflecting back on this, or people asking me like, how did we do that? And especially now we're in 2021 and like tensions are high again at CAMLR, and I keep trying to like remind myself like, no, like we did this. We did it, I think, because we worked at that intersection of science, policy, and the public. And I think that's what I've learned in my journey working as a scientist and a communicator, and now in the policy space, is that we really have to work at the intersection of those. And also that we got consensus because countries really did work to do trade-offs. There was that trust breaking, trust building, like rebuilding trust. There were specific individuals in the room that actually were really good at building trust of some of these countries that were skeptical. And there also was that leadership I mentioned to you of John Kerry, and he wasn't the only one of folks who really took leadership over this, that high-level diplomacy. So, I guess I should say, I feel like all that led to this political window of opportunity. And I want to just highlight that for a sec, because I feel like what was so important about that is that we had all the science in place, we had all the media in place, like people had this idea of the last ocean, at least the people we were working with, and we were ready. Like we were ready with all this stuff. And so the policy window was closed, it was closed, it was closed. And then finally when it opened, it's like we were ready to move through it. And I think that's an important thing for conservation, where if we wait for the policy window to open, like we're gonna miss it, right? Because we don't have all of our stuff prepared, especially with the science, at least I felt like, and I feel like it can be frustrating to do the science and be ready, and it's like the policy doesn't pass. But what we learned was like, you wait and then you force through it when it opens, right? And so this is just giving you a bigger picture. Here's Antarctica. The Ross Sea MPA is the large blue MPA in front of you. The South Orkney Islands MPA is the one further up on the map there. So that's what we have so far. And I mentioned to you that CAMLR committed to a network, right? Like we want to protect all of the map. And so this is what it looks like right now in terms of the proposed MPAs. So we have 3 additional proposals. One in the Antarctic Peninsula. I mentioned to you that place is melting like crazy, super high risk, major fisheries there. One in the Weddell Sea and one in the East Antarctic. So those 3 are on the table and will be negotiated in a month's time from now. And for us, it's become kind of personal. I want my children, including my daughter, Adele, who's actually named for the Adelie penguin, to know a world full of Adelie penguins. Actually, the last time I went to Antarctica, which was late 2019, I was in the peninsula where I used to see Adelies, and my daughter kept saying, send me a picture of an Adelie, and we couldn't find any because they are trying to move south, and places where they had nests have actually been taken over by other penguins that can survive the warming better. And their nests they have been using for thousands of years. So it's like a huge deal, because Adelie penguins have to nest on rocks, unlike parts of the peninsula that are actually like don't have ice all over them, and those are hard to find. And so they tend to stay at those nests. And so it was really sad for me, I guess, when I was like, of course I'll send you a picture of an Adelie, and there were none to be found. So these changes are happening quickly. And for us, it's like, yeah, we want a future full of Adelie penguins, right? So my daughter's not like, what happened to those things, you know? And my son is Orion Ross, I should say. So he's Ross for the Ross Sea. But we have to get all these countries to agree. And so currently we have some similar barriers that we had before with these MPAs on the table, a lot of geopolitical tensions, a lot of conflicting economic interests. And then it's been really hard negotiating during COVID-19, as you can imagine. Like here we are, like I actually can't see you all. I can't feel your energy. I can't like pull you aside and tell you something after this talk. And it's the same thing in the negotiations. I mean, the negotiations happen over coffee, over beers, over like in the sidelines, right? Like, yeah, they're happening at the table, but they're also really happening everywhere else. And so there just really hasn't been room for that. We did have the CAMLR meeting last year. It was online. It was at like terrible times of day for some countries, like connectivity issues in terms of internet. And so it like really didn't work. And we're gearing up for another online meeting in a month. So I'm not sure what's going to happen this year, but I remain hopeful. There is high level diplomacy happening. There's actually, the United States has become a co-proponent on some of the MPA proposals, which is amazing, with John Kerry back in the administration. He's working his efforts. Continued scientific effort. We are continuing to do science. Conservation organizations are super involved. And then, as I mentioned with the Ross Sea, we actually had a lot of the public pressure and support. We had like millions of people all over the world doing social media, writing people. And so I did put the latest hashtag there if you want to check out like the latest campaign that a lot of these groups are leading. It's the call on CAMLR. Then they have petitions going and a lot of other things going in this month, especially in this month build up. So I just want to close by, again, reminding you that in the Southern Ocean, we have tremendous human pressure happening right now in terms of fisheries, in terms of climate change, but that we have exceptional governance. And I've talked to you about the Antarctic Treaty and the Ross Sea MPA, but for me, it really is this place where we're, so far in my experience, I've seen us do things that I haven't even read about anywhere else, like where we really can come together as a global community. So thank you for your attention, and I am super happy to have a discussion with you all. And I will take my screen down. I know you're clapping.
Wow, I was clapping. Oh my God. Thank you for all of your work. Thank you for your graduate program that led you to randomly study toothfish.
Right?
And now all of this. Thank you. Students, we typically have people put stuff in the chat if you want to, and kind of line things up. We could, there's only about 40 of us on, so we could try just popcorning in or using the hand raise. Jason, what do you think? How should we do questions? I know students are going to have questions for you. You covered so much ground. And Jason, you might actually have a question for her to start off. Well, the students.
I think I'll open up to the students first, but I think let's just have people unmute themselves and let's see if we can do that in an orderly fashion.
There's a couple in the chat. I don't know if folks.
Yeah, let's go. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
So Mallory, do you want to go ahead?
Mallory's first. Yeah.
Yeah, you can ask your question to me too. Maybe that's easier and then everybody can hear it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just read it from here. So I'm wondering about, you mentioned the benefits that protected areas have for fisheries, the industrial benefits. Is that a political key to getting more of them established? Or does it cause conflicts where countries are interested in getting control of the industrial benefits and actually make it harder to agree on an MPA?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I guess first I should say the toothfish graduate program I did was Moss Landing Marine Labs. So very, very close to you guys in Moss Landing. So it's just a plug for Moss Landing, such a great place. Yeah, I don't know. I think like some of the conservation groups really hate talking about the fisheries benefits because there's a sense of like, we should do this for the sake of biodiversity conservation. This should not be about, hey, you're going to get to fish more. And I think I have mixed feelings about that. I feel like the science shows we can have both. And so I think like, why not emphasize that we can have both if the science is suggesting that. And then the international boundary claims, I think that could be part of it, right? So if New Zealand is leading the fishery in the Ross Sea, and now they're proposing an MPA in the Ross Sea, could be the sense of, and that's their historic territorial claim, like, wow, maybe they're just trying to like have good management so they can fish forever there because it's like where they have a stake. So I think you're onto something with that. Like it's all of that, right? So thank you for your question. And then Megan, you put your question in early too, if you wanna go, and I see the hands as well in the other chats.
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for such incredible presentation. Like I come from a STEM and politics background, so I love when it's such a mixture equally of both. Like it's incredible. So my question was more about on like the public mobilizing side, and I was just curious if you can give any recommendations or tips about how to just yeah, just have people want to mobilize and want to put pressure on something, especially with yours, where it's literally on the other side of the world. They don't even see it or interact with it. They wouldn't even think it directly affects them. So I was curious, like, how you really got people to want to be interested and push so heavily for it.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was like this 12-year thing really in the end of it. And I'm married to very talented conservation photographers. Photos are behind me. All those photos you saw in my talk are like his. And he, yeah, I feel like media is key, right? Like he was able to take these photos that helps people, I feel like, feel this place that was really far away, to actually have like a intimate experience with it. I feel like the documentary film did that. I feel like the power of media is huge. In terms of creating that intimate, like you have to create almost like that intimate experience for someone, right? Where they like feel a place. I also think that that's not sufficient usually. And in the case of the Ross Sea, what I think partly worked was that branding. And I kind of hate the idea of like branding anything, but branding that place as the last ocean. Like it literally became into people's minds, like they were like, oh my gosh, like how, wait, say that again, there's this last place, like how is that possible? And I think that was really powerful, both in the public and in the policy space. Like people started actually using that term like on the floor of CAMLR, right? And governments kind of understand like, oh my gosh, here's this last place, and I can take leadership on protecting it. So I think those were huge pieces in terms of like the public campaign side. And I also can't underestimate, like we literally, us and our counterparts in New Zealand, I mean, working out of garages, like getting paid nothing. It was like a total blood, sweat, and tears thing. Like, I feel like some people are like, hey, why don't you do this effort for the next MPA? And I'm like, no, I have kids. Like, I want to sleep. Like, I'm exhausted. It was intense. Like, we worked all the time, like every night till 2 a.m., every weekend, giving talks, producing the media, writing, working on the films, like editing the photography, pushing stuff constantly. So, and that's not sustainable, obviously. But yeah, and at the time there was also like there's a little bit more funding now around Antarctica than there used to be. But at the time for the conservation stuff, or like try to get to Antarctica as a photographer, like it took my husband 4 years to finagle his way down there. And so, so I can't underestimate like that. And then just getting public support and like social media obviously is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. At the time, it wasn't quite as big of a thing as it is now, but we'd literally like have showings of the film. We'd like show the film right outside CAMLR, and then we'd show it in other public spaces across New Zealand, and so all of that. So that's my long-winded question of saying, like, I think media is huge, talking to people is huge, right? And then that sort of having it have a unique thing, right? In the marine space, it's like it's easy for maybe all kelp forests to see the same or coral reefs to see the same. But if a place is really exceptional, how do we get people to understand that? And I think that leads to that intimate. It's far away. I know it's far away, but I want to know that it exists, and I want to know that it's like part of the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think David is next.
Yeah, first, just thank you for all your work. It's really amazing. But I kind of wanted to ask about some of the big current research going on in Antarctica, and like what potential effects those could have on the MPAs on the table, or even just for future conservation.
Yeah, we have a lot of ongoing work. There's a lot of places in Antarctica that we don't know a lot about, like where it's just maybe we know something about the summertime, or maybe we know something about the peninsula because we've been there a lot. But there's some places that like either people haven't gone to, or they've never gone to at certain times a year. So there's ongoing sort of like research expeditions to understand things. And there's places where like in the Weddell Sea, every expedition finds new species. Like, and if any of you have dabbled in biology, like my first trip to Antarctica too, we found like a new species of fish. Like, it's so cool. Like there's just like, there's so few places you can go that you're like, oh, species A, I guess, for now, until we figure out what it is. And so there's a lot of just like that, research going on like that. There's also research going on trying to understand the impacts of the fishery, research going on trying to understand the impacts of climate change, a lot of really cool modeling going on, trying to understand climate impacts. Some of the work I'm trying to do is to even understand connectivity better. How do things move around Antarctica? How is that changing under climate change? And things like that. So there's like tons of major gaps, believe it or not. I feel like it's a place ripe for research. It's just a matter of like getting funding to go there and getting funding to do it, because it is a faraway place, and COVID has just like put a halt on a lot of Antarctic research, as you can imagine. So Yeah.
Thank you.
Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start. Everyone else, just thank you for an awesome presentation. Learned a whole heck of a lot. Specifically, I'm super fascinated with Antarctica and the Antarctic Treaty. And with, well, one, obviously, as you mentioned, this being a really unique example of sort of negotiations in that general, I don't know, sort of like space and the high seas of like this like common heritage of mankind, blah, blah, blue stuff. Having worked in so intimately with like Antarctica, being in the room with all this happening and still being working since, and you mentioning that you have to kind of get ahead of these things, I guess is a two-parter. One, what's the general vibe, I guess, in the Antarctic community with that, especially with the mining ban coming up in a couple decades?
Sure.
And then also just, are there already efforts to get ahead of that curve to try to get as much in place ahead of? Obviously, there's going to be a lot to talk about at that point. So, 30 years doesn't seem like that much.
Yeah, no, awesome question. And certainly there's a mining ban, and yet countries can still do research of like the seafloor and sort of get a sense of what's there. Something to know is that, at least from my perspective, the Antarctic Treaty is still very strong. The Madrid Protocol, which is the mining ban, is still very strong. And to get rid of that mining ban, you would need, again, consensus, right, to get rid of that. And so it comes up for review, like that is true. But the unique thing about that review is it comes up for review, but it doesn't expire, right? There's no like expiration attached to that, which I think is a really important nuance, because there is a lot of dialogue around like, oh my God, it's all going to go to hell after that review. And when I've talked to people, they've emphasized to me that like those countries with claims like that mining ban to be there, right? So Australia has like 40% of the historic claim. And if mining happened, they wouldn't be able to control any mining that happened in that space. And that's my understanding. A part of where that even agreement came from was this sort of like, oh shoot, I don't really want people mining in my space. Well, then let's just all agree not to mine, and that's where it's an interesting where geopolitics can lead to really cool conservation outcomes, I guess sometimes. So I think all that stuff is strong. It was just a couple of years ago that all the treaty countries like re-emphasized their commitment to the Madrid Protocol. One thing that maybe is reassuring is that we don't even have the technology right now or like the feasibility to do that there. Maybe that's part of why the ban came into force. They were like, oh yeah, that's like too far away, too difficult, too dangerous. So I feel like it's good. And the treaty in terms of like being demilitarized, like no nuclear, sovereignty claims suspended, all of that is strong. I think what's different now is that the whole world is changing and you have different powers rising. And in really interesting ways that's playing out there. Like if you looked at the original countries, right, it's like this very old superpower club that's changing now. And I think that's cool actually, because it's like you have countries like China really challenging the power of the US and the UK and whatnot. And so I think it's an interesting space for understanding what's going on in the world, but I don't think there's a risk of like us mining it or the treaty going away or anything like that. I feel confident about that will stay for maybe forever, hopefully, or for our lifetime. So we, as long as we're here. A great question.
And before we go to Maddie's question, I just want to acknowledge that it's 7 o'clock. I really don't want to stop, but I also want to honor your time, Dr. Brooks. Are you willing to stay on for another question? Maybe
of course.
Another few minutes? Okay.
Yeah. Until you hear my children banging on the door, I can.
Okay. Okay.
I'll go fast. Thank you so much for talking. Also, this was an incredibly engaging presentation, and now I want to work in the Antarctic. It was really, really cool to hear about the scientists and the policymakers at the table together at CAMLR. That is unbelievable. I would love to hear more about that, but that's actually not my question. I was intrigued by the time limit that China proposed to put on the NPAs. What does that mean? Does that mean in the next like 2 years it's going to go away, or are we talking like 70 years? Because I do understand the desire to not have it be like permanent, unfortunately. But could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, totally. This is something like I honestly wish hadn't happened. Like the limited duration, we don't have any NPAs anywhere else that are like expire. the original ask was like forever, that didn't happen. Then it was like asked for 70 years, then it was asked for 50 years, and then countries came back with 20 years. And so the negotiation on that final moment was 35, which was just halfway between 20 and 50, like just to be clear, like that's not a science number. And a lot of the animals that live in the Ross Sea live longer than 35 years. So this is a difficult thing for like, will we be able to see the effectiveness of the MPA in 35 years, right? But the hope is that it's in place, people will see it works. And then, and this is where it's different. Like when I just talked about the Madrid protocol comes up for review, but it's like the default is it will continue. The Ross Sea MPA comes up for review and then it expires. And so countries would have to like renegotiate basically like, yes, we want to keep this MPA in place. And that's like, from my perspective, an unfortunate precedent in that whole like governance system of saying, you know, basically we need consensus to continue. In the case of other things, it was like consensus to get rid of it, but now it's like consensus to continue. But, you know, I've heard like, the thing is with international law, and maybe you all know more about this than me, to be honest, like I have never taken an international law class, but that getting it in place is like the key thing. Like you get governments to agree and then it's not scary and then they'll keep it in place. At least that's what some people have reassured me. That I think it remains to be seen, right? Like, will countries not agree to it in 35 years? So that was like just one of those like unfortunate compromises from my perspective that we had to go with. And just to say the scientists at the table, like, I mean, I agree with you. I haven't seen any system quite like that, where like you literally, the decision-making table has that diplomat and the scientists by their side. And you see during the meeting, the whole time, the scientist is like feeding into that process, like advising the diplomat. And I think that's part of what makes CAMLR extraordinary. And that sort of like, we make decisions based on science real, because the scientists are at the table. And a lot of times they're government scientists, but like, they're still scientists, right? Who are informing the process. And so I can't stress enough, like, what an amazing system I think this is to study. And to Alex's question too, like the Antarctic Treaty, like the Antarctic Treaty is an amazing agreement. It's one of these things that I think we can still learn from. Like how did we do that, right? And could we do that in other spaces? And again, and I think CAMLR is a similar case, like really extraordinary. Yeah.
One more question, Dr. Brooks?
Sure.
Don't feel no pressure, okay? No guilt. If you need to go feed your children or just get off Zoom, I totally understand. Okay. All right, Emily.
Thank you for taking my question. I really enjoyed your presentation. And my question is actually kind of about your presentation skills, because I feel like it was an incredibly engaging and entertaining presentation. And I had like no background in the Antarctic, and now I feel like I learned so much and I'm like invested in learning more. And so like, as all of us are, you know, going into careers in policy or science or like those kinds of fields, like if you have advice on how to build those public speaking skills, like how to present to an audience that might have no background in something that you're really passionate about, because I feel like it was a really effective presentation.
Oh, Emily, first, thank you so much for that feedback. I try, but I don't always know, you know, if it works. So I really, really thank you so much. Yeah, so I think I alluded to, so I did like a master's in marine science, and then I actually did like a graduate certificate actually at University of Santa Cruz in science communication. And it was a year-long intensive, but I feel like I learned so much in that year of, how to break down science, how to like present it in a way that's understandable. And you don't need to like get a degree, but I think like if your school has training, or if you even can like do a workshop on sort of how to communicate science, I think that's huge. There's a lot of really good tools to understand to do that. The other thing is, I'll just be frank in that I'm married to a creative person who I've seen give so many talks, and he's a storyteller. And I feel like at a certain point I was like, maybe I'll try a little bit of that sort of storytelling and get a little bit more creative. And yeah, I find that it's such a more helpful way to communicate. And especially as I've moved through my career and I've had this great opportunity to talk sometimes directly to governments and things like that. And I feel like I've had to really think about like a version of the talk I just gave. I first designed for this talk. I got invited to Chile and actually meet with the president of Chile and a bunch of other government folks. And I was like, oh my God, like this, I have to make them feel something. I have to like, you know, tell the story in such a way that it's not boring science, if that makes sense. And my understanding too, there's like supposedly four types of like learning styles, and I try to hit them all. Like some people like data, so I try to talk about data. Some people want to feel something, so I try to like tell a bit about myself, connect with you personally. And I'm not trying to think of the other two. I'm like not remembering it now, but like look at there's like these 4 ways of presenting and learning, and I didn't realize I was hitting them all, but someone told me later, like, oh, this is, you actually like hit them all, and these are the 4 things, and I realized like, oh, I should do every talk trying to speak to all the different people that you might have in a room, right? But pictures, like, oh my God, like if I didn't have my husband's pictures, I swear I got like my job at the university because I gave a talk with my husband's pictures, you know. But like having access to good media and having a good story, right? Like I tried to tell you a story and not just sort of present, like throw data at you, right? So yeah, and just to say too, like, feel free to email me. Like I have, I do virtual office hours too, since we're in like a pandemic, and that's just easy for people. So I'm like super happy to chat with folks and follow up with you. I've long loved the institute you guys are all at, and giving guest lectures for Christina Durde, if you know her, and so yeah, just really love that place. So and Peter, I see your question. I'm totally happy to take that if you want to. Do you want to say it out loud?
Sure. Thanks again for the talk. Question, keep it brief. What efforts are being taken to renegotiate the specifically the trench that you mentioned that was taken out of CAMLAR? And or is there a system built into the CAMLAR agreement for how to revisit it, expand it, et cetera?
Regarding the MPAs?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. In the Ross Sea MPA in particular. Yeah, right. My hope, my big hope is that when it comes up for review, that we might be able to negotiate bringing some of those areas back in. That's my hope, and I think we'll see what happens. So, and my also hope is that we can work on some of the fisheries management stuff in terms of the toothfish fishery itself, because like the MPA was designed, and the fishery, it didn't really like. It kind of constrained the fishery, but it didn't necessarily like limit it. And that might be something that I feel like we need to think about next. Like, can we continue taking out the amount we are without it damaging the ecosystem? So a lot of work to be done, I think. So,
Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
thank you all so much.
Thank you
It really,
so much.
really
And
was a pleasure.
what a phenomenal presentation. And I just want to tell the students, like, not every speaker is going to be like this, okay? Dr. Brooks, you've set such a high bar for beginning this Center for the Blue Economy speaker series, environmental justice, sustainability speaker series. Thank you so much. Jason, I'd love to leave the last thanks for you as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll just echo what everybody said. And it's great to see that you were working with Kerry. You know, you were probably at the Our Ocean conference, you know, and it was so sad to see that administration doing so much for the oceans replaced with one trying to destroy all life on Earth. And nice to have him back. So on that we can all celebrate. You know, we've done some work, you know, with our ocean climate stuff that's parallel to yours in the sense of kind of the movement building, but yours is much more extensive and much more impressive. So thank you deeply. We're very grateful.
No, thank you all. I'd love to stay in touch. And yeah, thank you for being here tonight. It was really a pleasure.